Hello, and welcome to this talk about Eastbourne artists. Many artists have been attracted to Eastbourne, partly, of course, because of our beautiful scenery. So to make the talk manageable, I've decided to focus on a group of artists who have some sort of association with the town or gallery. By the time you come to listen to this talk, all being well, the gallery will either just be about to reopen or have just reopened, and we'll have the opportunity to see some of these works again for ourselves. Where possible, I've chosen works which actually depict Eastbourne and its surroundings, although obviously I haven't been able to do that in every single case. I'm going to begin with probably the best known Eastbourne artist, and that is Eric Ravilious. The painting of him on the right was done by Phyllis Bliss, and we'll see one later on that she also did of his wife, Tirzah Garwood. The Towner, as most of you are probably aware, holds a very large collection of Ravilius's work, and in fact has a room which is completely devoted to him, and they change the display every few months. But Ravilious has been described by Alexandra Harris in her book Romantic Moderns as the most English of watercolourists. And whilst it's true that Ravilious made very effective use of watercolours, as we'll see, he also produced some very beautiful work in a whole range of media. Here on the left, we've got one of his early watercolours, which is a painting he did of Hampden Park in 1928. And the person sitting there is Tirzah Garwood, whom he was to marry in 1930. Ravilious wasn't actually born in Eastbourne. He came here in 1907 when his father went bankrupt and moved the family to Eastbourne and set up a new business. Ravilious went to the local secondary school, which he left in 1919 with a Cambridge Senior Local School Certificate with a distinction in drawing. And that was good enough for him to win a scholarship to the Eastbourne School of Art. He won another scholarship in 1922, and that enabled him to go to the Royal College of Art Design School. And the emphasis in that school was very much on training artists to earn a living. While he was at the Royal College of Art, Ravilious met many fellow students who became lifelong friends, including in particular his friend Edward Borden, and I'll mention him several times as we go through. But he was taught by Paul Nash, who encouraged him to do woodcuts. And here on the right, we've got one of his earlier woodcuts, 1924, called Sussex Church. And this is based on the church in Lullington. Ravilious won another scholarship in 1924, and this enabled him to travel to Italy, and he did this with Henry Moore. And in 1925, he exhibited some of his work in Paris. In 1930, as I mentioned, he married Tirzah Garwood, and I'll be talking about her later because she was also an artist. And they moved in 1931 to Great Bardfield in Essex, where they shared a house with Edward Borden, whom he met at the Royal College of Art, and with Edward's wife, Charlotte, who again was also an artist. And Ravilious and Garwood had 3 children, John, James, and Anne. Now here at the bottom, we've got a painting which he did in 1933 called Two Women in a Garden. And this is Tirzah on the right, shelling peas, and on the left, Charlotte Borden sitting reading, and this is in their garden in Great Bardfield. And you'll see as we go through that that motif of a woman sitting reading is one that Ravilious used over and over again. So I mentioned earlier that as well as being proficient in watercolours, Ravilious actually worked in a range of media, and I'm going to talk about some of his work under the headings here, beginning with woodcuts. The one on the left, called Manor Gardens, some of you may recognise this mound here. It was restored a couple of years ago, and it's called Horse Mound. You can find it if you're walking through Manor Gardens from Guildridge Park towards Compton Park Road, Compton Park Road, yes, and going with the Goths on your right-hand side. The one at the bottom, Boy Bird's Nesting, which of course is against the law now, again was one of his earlier woodcuts. And interestingly, the horizon at the bottom here is based on the downs at Willingdon. And interestingly, Ravilius's friend Percy Bliss, who was married to Phyllis, who did the portrait, which I showed you at the beginning, Percy Bliss actually posed for this woodcut by draping himself on the back of a sofa and wearing his rugby kit. With various partners, Ravilious was responsible for 3 large mural commissions. I'll show you some illustrations from them in a moment. With Edward Borden in 1928, and it took about 16 months altogether, he painted a set of murals for the refreshment room in Morley College, which was and still is an adult education college. I think it was called something like the College for Working Men and Women at the time. And these were unveiled by Stanley Baldwin, who was the Prime Minister at the time, who described them as having been painted with great happiness and joy. Here you can see there's a painting of Ravilious by Edward Borden called The Boy. And here he's working on the sketches for the Morley College murals. The Boy was one of Ravilius's nicknames, and he was rather shy, and that painting captures it quite well with his head sort of stuck in the plants, not looking at the viewer. In 1933, Ravilious, with his wife Tirzah Garwood, painted a set of murals for a brand new hotel, the Midland Hotel in Morecombe Bay. That took about 4 months. And in 1934, he painted a set of murals on the Colwyn Bay Pier in the refreshment pavilion there. So now we're going to look at some of the illustrations from these murals. The 2 at the top come from Morley College. The theme of the murals at Morley College was fantasy, and Borden and Ravilious drew on Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, and so on. The one on the left at the top, Life in a Boarding House, Ravilious admitted that this didn't have much to do with the themes of the murals, but it was based on a doll's house which Tirzah Garwood had made in Eastbourne. The one on the right is of local interest because you can probably see here the Long Man of Wilmington. This illustration here is from the Morecombe Bay murals, and the theme here was day and night. So for day, they showed coastal scenes, and the night scene was fireworks. And again, that's a motif which Ravilious used again. And for the Colwyn Bay Pier, the theme was a ruined underwater city with fish and plants growing in and around these broken arches. Unfortunately, all of these murals had a rather sorry end. Morley College was bombed during the Second World War, and the murals were completely destroyed, and something like 195 people were actually taking shelter in the refreshment room at the time, and 57 of them were killed in the bombing. The Morecombe Bay Midland Hotel was being built in quite a hurry, and the walls on which Ravilious and Garwood were working were still damp. The plaster hadn't been properly seasoned. And even as they were working, the murals began to deteriorate straight away. They had to keep stripping them off and redoing them. They went back in 1934 to try and restore them, but they only lasted for about 2 years. With the Colwyn Bay Pier, the pier fell into disrepair, and there's been a long and still ongoing ownership dispute. And the refreshment pavilion where the murals were has basically gone to rack and ruin. And one wall of these murals has been completely ruined by water. People did manage to salvage one wall. It's now in storage, it needs restoring, and it's not at all clear what's going to happen to it. But there was a rather happier story, because Sir Geoffrey Fry, who was Stanley Baldwin's private secretary, visited Morley College a few days before the official opening, and he was very taken by the murals there. And he also established a very quick rapport with Ravilious, and he commissioned him to paint some murals in his apartment. And the theme was tennis in the park. Now, these are not the murals. These are a painting on board, which is in the Worthing Art Gallery. But again, this scene is set in Manor Gardens. As you can see, there is the mound in the middle. It looks somewhat different. It's got a different thing on top of it. I think these are the tennis courts, which are now a skateboard park, but I'm not entirely sure. And anyone who's familiar with Ravilious's work will know that he sometimes moved things to aid the composition of the picture, so they're not always a strictly accurate representation of the landscape. One of these women running, I don't know which one, is Tirzah Garwood. One of the other media in which Ravilious worked was lithographs, and here you've got a lithograph of his largest, or a copy of his largest printed work, which was New Haven Harbour. He and Borden used to go on sketching trips and painting trips for several days and sometimes for several weeks. And they went to New Haven several times. And while they were there, they painted the ships and they painted the harbour. And Ravilious did this lithograph. And as I said, it's his largest printed work. And on the next page, we have some illustrations from lithographs which he did for a publication about shop fronts called High Street. It's a very charming little book. It has a commentary, a little text about each shop by Jim Richards. And I've chosen some of them just to illustrate what it looks like. The top left-hand corner, we have a shop selling fireworks. So again, that theme of fireworks, which you saw at the Morecombe Bay Hotel. Top right, we have an oyster bar. Bottom right, and I wonder who on earth the clientele was for this shop. This was a shop which sold deep sea diving equipment. You can't imagine that very many people would have wanted that. The bottom left-hand one has a personal resonance because this is a shop just behind Westminster Abbey, which sold clerical clothing. And I used to work just around the corner from this shop, and I walked past it almost every day. It only closed down a couple of years ago. And as you can see, Ravilious did these illustrations in 1938. So it had quite a long life. Ravilious was a very successful commercial artist. Those of you who visited the show at the Town a few years ago called Ravilious and Friends may remember that part of the exhibition was mocked up as a bookshop to display the different illustrations which the various artists had done for presses. And Ravilious worked for two presses, the Nonsuch and the Cockerell presses. He also did posters for Green Line coaches and a booklet for Southern Railway and catalogue covers. And he did some homewares for Wedgwood between 1936 and 1940. So these are some of the designs that he did for Wedgwood. These are still very popular. As far as I'm aware, Wedgwood doesn't actually manufacture them anymore, but they're still sold for very high prices on places like eBay. This series in particular, the garden series, was very, very popular. And you can see that, again, Ravilious is using this motif of a woman sitting reading, and that's almost identical to the picture of Charlotte Borden sitting under the tree in the garden at Great Bardfield. This bowl shows the boat race. When Ravilious and Garwood were first married, they lived in Hammersmith for a year and they watched the boat race from their flat. And again, those of you who went to the exhibition at the Town may remember seeing this bowl because it was on display there. One of the things that Ravilious did was to design a coronation mug for the coronation of Edward VIII. As we know, Edward VIII abdicated before he was actually crowned, and so this coronation mug was then repurposed for the coronation of George VI. However, there's a nice little story associated with the original, because one of Ravilius's friends, Cecilia Dunbar Kilburn, opened a shop in Mayfair called Dunbar Hay, and she ordered quite a lot of these mugs to sell. And one day, none other than Wallace Simpson came in to buy one of them. Now, I'm returning to some of Ravilius's coastal scenes. And if you remember the painting I showed you right at the beginning of Hampden Park, you can see that his style had changed considerably in 10 years. And some people argue that his painting style became very influenced by the woodcut work that he did. But I'm sure everybody recognises these two scenes of Cuckmere Haven and of Beachy Head. During the Second World War, Ravilious was enlisted as a war artist, and he worked at Chatham Dockyard. He sailed to Norway in April 1940, and he painted the ships. He went to Portsmouth and did the Submarine series, some of which I'll show you in a moment. And he spent time at Newhaven and Eastbourne, where he painted the coastal defences. He also spent 6 months with the army. And in 1942, he went to Reykjavik. And the day that he arrived there, a plane had gone missing. The very next day, Ravilious went out on another plane to search for the missing plane, and that plane too also went missing, and it was never found, and Ravilius's body was never found. And he's commemorated, and I'll show you a photograph of this in a moment, on the Chatham Naval War Memorial. But these are some of the lithographs that he did in Portsmouth when he was stationed with the Submarine crew. And some people reckon that these are amongst his finest war artist works. My own personal favourite is this one here, the Periscope. I just love the blue eye here with the light reflected through the periscope. And interestingly, the British Museum used that print as the cover for a book which it published on modern prints. As I mentioned, Ravilious was killed in action, and he is commemorated on the Chatham Naval War Memorial. Here is the plate which commemorates him, and here is a newspaper cutting which talks about it. I'm now going to move on to talk about Tirzah Garwood, who, as I've mentioned, was married to Ravilious, but was also an artist in her own right. And you can see the bottom right-hand side, there's a painting of her, which is the companion of the painting of Ravilious, which was done by Phyllis Bliss. There's a picture of their engagement here, and of Tirzah Garwood when she was 15. Like Ravilious, she wasn't actually born in Eastbourne, but their family moved here when her father retired from the army. He was a colonel in the British Army. Her mother was the daughter of a Belfast shipbuilder, and they moved to Arundel Road in Eastbourne, and she went to school here. She was impatient with some aspects of Eastbourne life, and in particular, she really disliked the Sunday morning stroll on the western lawns, which is when the great and good of Eastbourne walked around between church and lunch, and that told people that they were well off enough to have somebody at home cooking their lunch for them. In 1925, Garwood went to Eastbourne School of Art, where she was taught by Ravilious and also by others, including Reeves Fawkes and Oliver Senior. And they married, as I mentioned, in 1930, after she'd broken off an engagement, an informal engagement, which she had with Bob Church. He was the son of a neighbouring army family, and Garwood felt that if she married him, she wouldn't be able to work as an artist, and that was what she really wanted to do. So she broke it off and married Ravilious instead. One of the things she learned at Eastbourne College was to do woodcuts, and she very quickly developed her own style. And after about a year, Ravilious began to learn from her. when I went to the exhibition at the town of Ravilious and Friends, I was really struck by how witty they are. One of the first sets that she did was a set of the Four Seasons, and her father, Colonel Garwood, talks in his diary of the day that Tirzah bought her first woodcut home, and it's thought that it was this one on the left, the woodcut of Spring. Now, a lot of people, if they were doing a woodcut of Spring or an illustration of Spring, they might think about doing the bulbs that are coming into flower, or the leaves of the trees that are coming into leaf, or lambs gambling in the field, or whatever. But she instead has chosen to portray it by looking at spring cleaning. And in particular, you can see that she has the person on her hands and knees doing the very hard work in the foreground. The one of summer, again, it's very amusing. You can see it's Eastbourne Beach with the beach huts there, and you've got this girl on an inflatable horse, I think it is, two girls larking about here, one of them swimming through the water. And this set of woodcuts was, all four of them, all Four Seasons, were exhibited with the Society of Wood Engravers in 1927, and very much admired by the Times newspaper. So she had press coverage for these woodcuts. Here's some more. The one on the left, the crocodile. Again, this witty side where you've got this young girl here leaning out to pat the little dog on the edge of the pavement. And this, the window cleaner, shows her father sitting at his desk. While she was at Eastbourne College, the lecturers there, and particularly Ravilious, used to take groups of students on sketching holidays, sometimes for a fortnight at a time. And in 1927, he took a group to Barcombe. And this is really where the romance between Ravilious and Garwood started. This is a watercolour on the left of Barcombe Mill, which Garwood did. And on the right, another woodcut of Ravilious's, and this is of Garwood sitting reading in Barcombe. So again, that motif of a woman sitting reading. And this was part of a series which he did of the signs of the zodiac. After leaving Eastbourne School of Art, Ravilious went to the Central School of Art in London. She'd won a silver medal at Eastbourne. And even when she was a student, she was able to earn enough from her art in order to defray some of her expenses. And as I mentioned earlier, they moved to Great Bardfield. They had 3 children. In 1941, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. 42, she was widowed and obviously left a young widow with 3 young children to look after. In 1946, she married Henry Swansea, who was a BBC producer. Unfortunately, in 1948, her cancer returned and she died in 1951, still quite a young woman. But she, like her husband, was a successful commercial artist. She did a lot of work for the BBC. She designed the masthead for The Listener and also motifs for Ariel, the in-house magazine. And she produced illustrated booklets for operas and plays which were broadcast on the radio. For example, she did pen and ink images for Francesca di Rimini and also for Arthur Sullivan's Ivanhoe. As I mentioned earlier, with Ravilious, she did the murals at the Midland Hotel, and here's a picture of them working. So here you've got the fireworks, which I showed you earlier. And this one here is the day motif, so night and day. She also, with Charlotte Borden, made marble papers, and she did these in a tin buff. And again, these were quite successful. They sold in the shop, the Dunbar Hay shop, which I mentioned earlier, which Wallace Simpson visited. And they were used for things like lampshade covers and also end papers for books. One of the publishers which used them was the Everyman Press. And some of you may remember those really quite attractive small volumes that Everyman used to produce, which had very nice covers and nice end papers. And as I said, Garwood, some of her marble papers were used by Everyman Press. And the Victorian Albert Museum actually bought several of these marble papers, and these can be found in their archive. After she was widowed, she returned to working as an artist in 1944, and she did some paintings. And here we've got one called The Springtime of Flight, which is in the Towner Gallery. It was shown in an exhibition last year, which was curated by Caroline Lucas. And in her later paintings, Garwood often adopted the perspective of a small child. And you can see this quite clearly in this painting. So it's as if a small child is looking up through the flowers at the aeroplane above. She also made 3D models of Essex houses, and she made collages of Essex buildings. And in 1942, she wrote an autobiography called Long Live Great Bardfield. That was only actually published a few years ago, and it was published by Persephone Press, and I'll mention them again later. Now, artists can be remembered in many ways, and I thought you might like to see these two examples of how Garwood and Ravilious have been remembered. Most of you probably know that Brighton buses often have the name of a famous person on the front, and this one, which is the 12A, which runs from Eastbourne all the way to Brighton, up the A259, has Tirzah Garwood as the named person on the front, and here we've got the Ravilious Hotel in Eastbourne. But I'm now going to move on to talk about Eric Slater, and I'm slightly cheating here because Eric Slater didn't actually live in Eastbourne. He lived in Seaford, but as I'll show you later, he did a very lovely print of Eastbourne. In his time, he was very successful. He did woodblock prints, and the one on the left of Seaford Head, which he did in 1930, won the gold medal of the International Printmakers of California. The one on the right is of Seaford Coast Guard Station, also done in 1930. He was born in London, and after his father died, he moved when he was 8 years old with his mother and his aunt to Bexhill, then to Winchelsea, and then to Seaford. And he attended Hastings School of Art. As I mentioned, he produced woodblock prints using Japanese techniques, and he was taught these by a Sussex neighbour, Arthur Rigdon Reed. And it's possible that Reed had actually travelled to Japan to learn these techniques. Now, woodblock prints were very popular in the mid-war period when a lot of new houses were built, because they were a way of having good art in your house, but without paying a lot of money. Slater's mother died in the late 1930s, and this is a very sad story. He stopped producing any art after the death of his mother, and he gradually moved to smaller and smaller houses until eventually he lived in a nursing home, and he died in complete obscurity in 1963. When the notice for his death was put in the newspaper, absolutely no mention whatsoever was made of his art. And it was really the Towner which resuscitated his reputation. I'll come to that in a moment. But as I said, he was very well regarded in his time. His prints were exhibited in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, Austria, South Africa. A man called Campbell Dodgson, who was the keeper of prints at the British Museum, he bought 4 of Slater's prints and then bequeathed them to the British Museum collection. And the Contemporary Art Society gave 2 of his prints to the Victoria and Albert, and one of them is also in the Auckland Art Gallery in New Zealand. And he has been called the Sussex Hokusai. And I'm sure most of you recognise that print of Hokusai's on the left, the Great Wave at Kanaka. And it's been argued that this one by Slater, called Rough Sea, actually uses some of Hokusai's imagery. Here is the one that I mentioned earlier of Eastbourne. You can see the Wish Tower there, done in 1936, around 1936. And as you can see, Eastbourne looks a much quieter place than it is now. But as I mentioned, the Towner had an exhibition in 2012 and produced a very nice little booklet to go with it, which partly helped to rehabilitate Slater's reputation. And one of his prints also turned up on the Antiques Roadshow with Fiona Bruce. So that got television coverage. And there was also a small item on Country File about him. So that he's actually better known now than he was when he died in the 1960s. The next artist I'm going to talk about has a particular connection with the Towner Gallery. That is Donald Chisholm Towner, who was the great nephew of John Chisholm Towner. And it was John Towner's legacy of £6,000 and 30 paintings, which formed the basis of the Towner Gallery, which is just about to celebrate its centenary in 1923. Donald Towner was born in Eastbourne, and he studied at Eastbourne and Brighton Schools of Art and also at the Royal College of Art. And he moved to Hampstead in 1927. Now, because he lived in London, most of his paintings were of London. He painted landscapes, he painted churches. So at the bottom here, you've got a picture of Heath Street in Hampstead. But I did manage to find this painting, which he did of chalk quarries in Amberley. So that's a bit more local to us. As well as being a painter, Towner did travel posters, and he also did a set of illustrations for a publication called Abbeys of Britain. And he wrote several books on English creamware and ceramics. Creamware was a particular kind of ceramic ware which was developed by Josiah Wedgwood and which became extremely popular and was copied in places like France and Russia and so on. And one of Donald Towner's paintings, Alice Ashley on a Garden Seat, was used as the front cover for a novel called Someone at a Distance by Dorothy Whipple, which is published by Persephone Press, which also published Tirzah Garwood's autobiography. And Towner also wrote an autobiography called Reflections, which was published in 1979. William Gere, who was born in Scotland, his connection with the Towner is that he was curator for 6 years. He studied at the Glasgow School of Art. He spent time in Paris, and he traveled very widely in Europe on a scholarship. And during the Second World War, he was in the armed forces, and he joined the Monuments Commission, and he traveled around Europe. This commission was looking for art which had been stolen during the Second World War. There was a film made recently with George Clooney called The Monument Men, and William Gere was one of those. And he's been called by Rachel Cook in The Observer, the painter that Britain forgot. A lot of his paintings, I'm going to talk about 2 of them, were associated with controversy, and one of them here, Autumn Landscape. He painted in 1950. The Arts Council of Great Britain in 1950 commissioned 50 artists to produce pieces of work for the Festival of Britain. This is the one that William Gere did. And he won the Arts Council Purchase Prize. So this painting was actually bought by the Arts Council for its collection. And there was an absolute uproar in the press about it. Hugh Gaitskell, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, said, "Why is the nation wasting its money on this rubbish?" As you can see, Gere was very much an abstract artist. But as well as his paintings, he was a pioneer of silkscreen printing, and he produced about 100 designs for fabric and for wallpaper. As I mentioned, he was curator of the Towner Gallery between 1958 and 1964. And he really put the Towner on the map as a gallery of modern art. It was rated as one of the best in the country outside London in 1962 by the Observer. However, it has to be said that Gear's time at the Towner wasn't entirely a happy one. To quote one of his biographers, every worthwhile purchase, quote, had to be fought for against narrow-minded councillors. Here's another of his paintings which was associated with controversy. On the left, March Landscape, which he painted in 1952. And this was bought for the Suter Art Gallery in Nelson on South Island of New Zealand by Lady Annesley, who was a trustee of the gallery. When she got it back to New Zealand, the other trustees were not very pleased at all. And again, there was a huge uproar in the press about it. The Nelson Evening Mail ran a whole series of debates about it, which led to Lady Annesley actually resigning from the Board of Trustees. But interestingly, this painting had a huge influence on New Zealand artists, and people who've been to New Zealand will know it has a very vibrant visual arts culture. And in particular, one of New Zealand's most famous artists, Colin McCahon, was very, very influenced by William Gear's work. Now, there's a little coda to this because I was in New Zealand last year and I was in Nelson and I went to the Suter Art Gallery to try and see this painting, and I looked for it and I couldn't find it, and went to the reception desk and asked them where it was, and they hadn't heard of it. And are you sure about this? Yes, I think you've got it. Anyway, somebody on reception got out their catalogue and found it, and it was in their storeroom. So not only was William Gear forgotten about in Britain, but he was forgotten about in New Zealand as well. But like Slater, he was very highly rated abroad. So he was very highly rated in Paris and in Amsterdam. He had solo exhibitions in 1944 in Siena and Florence. And in 1949, he exhibited with Jackson Pollock in the United States of America. However, he was finally recognised in Eastbourne in October 2019 when a blue plaque to him was unveiled on the walls of the old Towner Gallery in Borough Lane. The next painter that I'm going to talk about is Harold Mockford. And he has a link with William Gear because William Gear, when he was curator of the Towner, bought this painting, Eastbourne, and it was the first of Mockford's paintings which the Towner bought. They now hold several pieces of his work. And again, there was a big fuss about this. It cost £25. You can see the press coverage here. And this painting was described by one councillor as subversive, and other people called it decadent. And one person said it made Eastbourne look like a snow-covered slag heap. However, as we shall see, Mockford became a favourite in Eastbourne. He was born here. He lived in Bradford Street in Old Town, was evacuated during the war. And as a child, he went to art classes at the Saturday Art Club at the Towner Gallery. He left school to work as a dental technician, but he went to evening classes at Eastbourne School of Art. He married, he had 5 children, and he worked for most of his working life as a dental technician, and therefore he painted in his spare time. He focused mainly on local land and seascapes, and he said that he felt that he painted best when he was painting places that he knew well. And he mainly worked in oil on board. He had a solo show at the Towner in 1959 when William Gear was curator. And he was chosen as a National Parks hero for his paintings inspired by the South Downs. As I said, he mostly painted locally. He moved to Newhaven in 1996 and often paints the harbour there and the downs at Newhaven. When the new Towner Gallery opened in 2009, his painting, When the Lights Come On, which I'll show you in a moment, was crowned the People's Choice winner. And in 2012, the Towner held an 80th birthday retrospective for him. Mockford has said that he knows that his paintings are finished when they reach that perfect moment of strangeness. I've just chosen 3 here because I think most of you will recognise the places that he's depicted. Top left-hand side is the little park, and this is Morecombe Park. So this is taken from the road. You can see there's the gate there, there's the pond there, the little lake, and St Mary the Virgin Church on the hillside behind. Here you've got cars at Berlin Gap. That's a view that many of us are familiar with. And at the bottom, the bandstand. And he's used the colour in quite an interesting way there to get the sky to tone with the turquoise of the bandstand roof. And this is the painting which was crowned the People's Choice when the new Towner Gallery opened in 2009. It was painted in 1989. And Mockford has said that his favourite time of day is just when it's getting dark and the light is beginning to fade. And I think he's captured this very well in this painting. And again, you can see that it's Morecombe Park. So here you have the gates again, the small lake, St Mary the Virgin, and then the houses going up Church Street and the A259. I'm going to finish by talking about a contemporary artist, Pat Latham. Obviously, there's any number of contemporary artists that I could have chosen from. The reason I've chosen Pat is because, like a lot of artists, she works in a range of media. But one of the things that she does is to make collages from materials which she picks up from the beach in Eastbourne. So she'll walk along the beach and pick up bits of wood, bits of fishing twine, bits of net, whatever, and then assembles them into collages. And I think that's an appropriate way to end the talk, because these collages are literally made from the stuff of Eastbourne. That's the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me. And as I said at the beginning, all being well, we should be able to go to the Towner again soon and to see some of the works that I've talked about. Thank you.